Hello everyone, welcome to ASCENT session of Labor Codes in India. My name is Rashesh Doshi and I'm the Managing Director of Talent Corner HR Services. I'm a part of the Illuminati Trust Group from the Mumbai chapter of ASCENT.
Hi there, my name is Gaurav Khemani and I'm the Managing Director of Rollick Ice Creams based out of Calcutta. I am part of the Manthan Trust Group, which is ASCENT's first All India Trust Group. Let me take this opportunity to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. P.V. Murthy leads the employment and labor practice at ELP. A qualified lawyer and the university topper in labor laws, Dr. Murthy earlier served as the Chief HR Officer at the Indian Hotels Company as well as Coca-Cola in India. He has more than 3 decades of rich experience as an HR practitioner. Dr. Murthy has been involved in the process since the conceptualization of the codes, providing inputs to the drafting teams on behalf of the industry associations. So let us start the sessions with Dr. Murthy providing some light on the topic New Labor Codes in India. Dr. Murthy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on this session, Gaurav and Rashesh. Special thanks to ASCENT. And I think that, you have set the context very well about the new labor codes. And we know that many of the employers at this point in time are very curious to know more about these labor codes and also a bit anxious about also because we have been hearing various things about these labor codes. Let me give you a context about it. We know that these 4 new labor codes, the Code on Wages, which was notified in 2019, and the subsequent 3 codes, which got notified in 2020, the Industrial Relations Code, the Code on Social Security, the Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code, all these 3 got notified in 2020. So while there have been several changes that have been brought in with these codes, I'm going to talk about 5 specific changes that have been brought in, which to my mind are major changes. The first one is the standardization of wage definition. Earlier, there used to be different wage definitions under different labor legislations. And now there is one standardized definition of wage. The second one, we all know that the minimum wages were notified by the appropriate governments or the state governments in the past. That's going to continue even now also. But the change is that the central government will notify the national floor wage. The most important thing here is that the minimum wages notified by the state governments cannot be lesser than that of the national floor wage that will be announced by the central government. That is the second major change. The third major change, I would say, is for the first time, the fixed term employment has been defined. And the definition of fixed term employment, it says that it's a written contract between employer and the employee who joins the company on a fixed term basis for a particular period. But the most important thing is the gratuity entitlement for fixed term employees is that of 1 year, as again is to 5 years, as we all know, for the employees on the rolls of the company. The fourth one I would say is that the recognition of trade unions. For the first time in India, through a central act, Industrial Relations Code, a process has been outlined as to how a negotiating union or a negotiating council needs to be recognized by an employer within the unit. And the fifth one, I would say that again, for the first time, gig workers, platform workers, and home-based workers have been defined with a purpose to bring them under the social security scheme, like employee state insurance, and also to cover them under certain welfare measures like accident and death insurance, etc. So I would say that these are the 5 major changes that have been brought in. And I also must mention that all these 4 labor codes repeal 29 of the erstwhile labor legislations. And the objective of the government here is to simplify, consolidate, and amend the labor legislations. I would say that it is a very, very progressive step in the right direction by the central government.
you for sharing this with us. I'd like to know a little bit about the complexities of the labor code law.
Okay. See, there are several positives. Like I said, there are several positives in these labor codes. But since you have asked me about the complexities, the first complexity is on the definition of wage, which I mentioned as point number one as the most important change. The definition of wage is a bit complex, and an employer needs to understand it thoroughly in depth. That is one of the complexities, and I'll speak a little bit more as we move along. The second one I would say is that some of the social security schemes like Provident Fund, the liability on some of these social security schemes and other benefits like leave encashment or overtime could go up for many of the employers. And for some of the employers, the amounts could go up significantly. That is, I would say that is another complexity. And then the third one is the leave encashment, which was earlier only at the time of the employee leaving the organization. Now the leave encashment is at the end of every year. In fact, the worker can demand for encashment of his or her leave, and 30 days can be carried forward to the next year. And of course, I also would talk about not having secret ballot as part of the union recognition process could also lead to certain complexities in some of the units where there are multiple unions. These are the complexities I would say that these labor codes could bring in, Rashesh.
Dr. Murthy, you mentioned about the complexities around the definition of wages. So, I mean, at this stage, would it be possible for you to, let us know what is the new definition of wage, and are there any exceptions to this, and how will that impact the SME sector?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Gaurav. See, it's like this. I'll try to simplify this definition. In the first place, everything, all remuneration gets covered. All remuneration paid in kind or cash gets covered in the definition of wage. And specifically, the definition talks about basic wage, dearness allowance, or retaining allowance, if any. So net, the first part is everything gets covered under the definition of wage. The second part deals with some of the exclusions. Some of the exclusions, they have given certain exclusions which would not form part of the definition of wage. So far, so good. The biggest catch here is that such exclusions cannot be more than 50% of the wage, which means what? 50% of the gross total remuneration would be taken for the purpose of computation of Provident Fund or gratuity or certain other benefits like leave encashment, overtime, etc. So that's where the complexity comes in, from the fact that these changes have been made for many of the employers whose basic is as low as 25% or 30% of the total remuneration. There could be a significant increase in terms of these social security benefits. This is where I would advocate all SMEs to get into the details and look at their compensation structure and correct it. And also, for example, if the exclusions are not up to 50% as permitted by the code, then the SMEs would be losing out. So this is the time where the SMEs, with full compliance in mind, the SMEs need to look at their salary structures or compensation structures for various categories of employees and take the decisions as per the law and what it prescribes. This is what I would say to answer your question,
Gaurav. Thank you for sharing this with us. Now, could you explain in terms of how we can be fully compliant working around the costs?
Yeah, no, it goes without saying that you need to be compliant. In fact, the penalties have been increased 10 times in many of the cases, and the government is very, very particular about strict compliance. And I'm also sure, having known you and having worked with many of the SMEs, all of you are for 100% compliance. So how do we work around these costs? One of the things is that, like I was saying earlier, 50% of the exclusions. What are these exclusions? Let me briefly touch upon those exclusions also. The exclusions are aspects like statutory bonus or house accommodation or certain amenities provided like water, electricity, or medical at those residential accommodation, the provident fund contribution, conveyance allowance, and gratuity, retrenchment compensation, any sums paid to defray special expenses of an employee to do his or her job. These are the exclusions that have been provided. Let's take, for example, in the case of one of the SMEs, the exclusions are less than 50%, which means what? The employer will obviously would be paying the PF contribution or other benefits on 70 or 80% of the total gross remuneration, which is not the intent of the legislation. This is where, having a look at it and making certain decisions, of course, not really bothering the employees or not really putting them in any kind of inconvenience, involving them and taking those decisions. And as per the law, wherever certain changes are to be brought in, the employers can take such calls.
Dr. Murthy, just a follow-up question on the previous one. I mean, you mentioned for the purpose of PF, like as a social security, the new wage definition is at a minimum 50%. Are there any other benefits that is covered in this, in how the new basic is treated in the new labor codes?
See, it's like this. First of all, let me address this 50% thing. Many of the employers associations have made representations to the government requesting for having a relook at this 50%. The government might, we do not know yet, but the government might take a decision, favorable decision, and it might be 55%, 60, 65. We do not know what is the percentage, but we are all expecting some kind of favorable decisions from the government on this 50% thing. So that is one thing. So I'm saying this so that the employers or the SMEs won't really lose their sleep over this 50% thing. Having said that, it is an imperative to have a look at the salary structure or wage structure and understand as to what kind of liability this brings in and make certain provisions in the books of accounts and be prepared for it or take certain actions as per the legal legislations. This is one part of it. The benefits part of it, certainly, yes, of course, there is complete transparency in terms of what are the elements or components that are part of a salary, both in kind as well as cash. So all these are now listed down. Even the kind, remuneration paid in kind, up to a maximum of 15% of the total wage needs to be added back to the wages. This is another thing, that I must mention here. So net, while this wage definition has created some amount of angst among the employees, I think that, there is not much of a worry that it brings in, but at the same time, a caution needs to be adopted by the SMEs and start looking at their structures.
Dr. Murthy, one last question before we close the session. When do you think is the new Labor Code Act going to come into recommendation?
That's $1 million question, Rashesh, but that's a good question. The government's intention was to implement all these 4 labor codes from 1st of April 2021. Like I said, both the houses of parliament have passed these codes and the president also has given his assent. So that means these 4 codes are the law of the land. The only thing that is pending is the notification, the official notification from the government of India is pending. And like I said, the government wanted to implement these labor codes from 1st of April 2021. But what we understand is that the state rules have not yet been formulated, and that's where there is some amount of delay in it. We can expect some delay. And that's what we foresee. How much delay? Perhaps it's a couple of months delay is what we think of. So that's my answer. I'm not very clear on the exact date of its implementation because there is no such notification. but very soon these codes will be implemented by the government.
Great. So I would like to thank Dr. Murthy on behalf of ASCENT for conducting this session and sharing his valuable insights with everyone. We are sure that the ASCENT cohort members are going to benefit a great extent with this information. Thank you, Dr. Murthy. Thank you, Rashesh.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on this session.